Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
Hi, I'm Leslie Finger. Paul, I've heard people on TV talk about the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which they call NAEP. What is NAEP?
NAEP is the nation's report card. It was set up by the U.S. Department of Education as a result of an act of Congress. It's a test administered to representative samples of students throughout the United States, as well as to representative samples of students in each state and the District of Columbia. And it's also given to students in 20 urban school districts.
When was NAEP first set up?
Well, the beginning of NAEP goes back to the 1960s. At first, it reported information on student performance only in math and reading at ages 9, 13, and 17 for the United States as a whole. But over the years, it has broadened its vision to include other subjects, to include students in grades 4 and 8, and students in every state.
Why was NAEP created in the first place?
Well, people started worrying about whether or not there was a decline in student test performance. They were relying upon the SAT tests, the tests that are used for admission to colleges and universities. Those tests were showing a decline in student performance beginning in the 50s and pretty dramatic ones after 1967. So people said schools were getting worse, but other people said, no, just more kids are applying for college today than ever before. And anytime you have more people taking the test, your average scores are going to go down. And besides that, only a fraction of high school students ever take the SAT. The test simply does not show the full picture of what's happening in school. We need a better test.
And I've heard the term used representative sample along with testing. What does that mean?
NAEP is a representative sample of students because it is like a poll. It draws names out of the hat to decide who's going to participate in the test. Now, we know that polls can estimate the outcome of an election from information from only a few people. The secret to getting a good poll is always the concept of randomization. So if you pick people at random, pick the names out of a hat, you give everybody in the population an equal chance of being selected for the sample. Sampling theory is very technical and sophisticated, but the basic idea is that you give everybody the same chance of falling into the sample. It's a little bit like the lottery. The lottery is set up on the principle of randomization, and people participate in the lottery because they believe they have the same equal chance of winning as anybody else participating in the lottery, as long as there's no cheating.
How big of a sample do you need?
Well, the bigger the sample, the more accurate the results will be. But a sample of just 1,000 individuals will give you a pretty precise set of information.
Won't teachers teach to the test, biasing the results?
Well, this could happen, but it's not likely to happen because, first of all, they don't know what's going to come on the test, and secondly, they don't have many incentives to. The NAEP is a test which is administered in a situation where nobody will know how the student does, or the school does, or how the classroom does. So for that reason, most scholars think that the NAEP is not subject to teaching or manipulation at the local level, and therefore its tests are reliable.
And what do you mean by reliable?
Well, reliable means that if you give the same test over and over again, you're going to get pretty much the same results except for a little sampling error.
Okay, and does that make them valid?
Reliable is the first step towards validity, but validity really refers also to whether or not the test tells you what you want to know. And that all depends on what you want to know. So in the case of the reading and math tests in NAEP, the governing board said, we want to know if the kids know the answers to these questions. Now, other people will say, we don't really care whether they know the subject as it's taught in school. We want to know if they can apply it in everyday life. And so those people will say, well, the NAEP test doesn't really tell me what I want to know. So validity is a matter of, like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. You can't be sure one way or the other ever whether something is valid because it's a bit up to what people want to know.
How about international PISA tests? I've also read about the PISA in the newspapers, and they usually say that US students don't perform as well as students in other countries. How does PISA know that?
Well, PISA is the program for international student assessment. PISA. It's a program organized by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an international group. It's been around since the year 2000. It's been administered many times, and it's very similar to the NAEP. The big difference is it's administered only to 15-year-olds, and its tests are more applied. Can you use this information in everyday life? So in that sense, it's a little bit different from NAEP.
Does PISA use the same sampling procedure as NAEP? Is it as valid and as reliable?
It is. It basically learned from NAEP and has used a lot of the same techniques that NAEP applied within the United States and put that on an international scale. The United States Department of Education participates in PISA testing, and they wouldn't do so if they didn't think it was a reliable test.
Since the passage of the federal law No Child Left Behind in 2002, every state administers a test to every student in grades 4 through 8 and again in high school. Are these tests the same as NAEP and PISA?
Well, they have many similarities, but there are some key differences. The state tests are high-stakes tests instead of the low-stakes tests like PISA and NAEP. They're high-stakes tests in the sense that the results of these tests are made available to the public. And sometimes even the performance in specific classrooms are used to decide whether or not teachers should be kept on or whether they should be let go. So there's more incentives for cheating, and there's more incentives to make sure that you prepare students well for these tests. So it's less, you can be less certain with these state tests. But the other factor that's different is that they have set a lower bar for performance. So on many tests at the state level, students will be said to be proficient when they don't do well enough to score at the proficient level as NAEP defines it.
What else would I or anyone need to know about these tests?
Well, there's many aspects to testing. People get PhDs in testing. So we've just scratched the surface here. But I think these basics will help us assess how student performance has changed in the United States over the years and how the United States compares to other countries around the world. But to talk about this further, we're going to ask Josh Goodman, a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, what he thinks about testing in the U.S. context. I have with me this morning Joshua Goodman, an economics professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, to talk about various methods issues that come up when you're doing education research. Josh, you've done a lot of education research over the years. Tell me about testing. The National Assessment of Educational Progress is sometimes called a low-stakes test because no student is going to fail anything on the basis of how they perform on this test, and no teacher is going to be held accountable. So what do you think of low-stakes tests? Do students take them seriously enough?
I think students do take them somewhat seriously. High-stakes tests are great because people are putting in the effort. Teachers are teaching subjects about those tests because their jobs may depend on those. That students care about them because whether they get to graduate from high school may depend on them. But I also think that these low-stakes tests actually do measure something. I think students take them somewhat seriously. We see lots of evidence that there are variations in these test scores across states in the U.S., for example, and these variations do correspond pretty well to things we know about these school systems. So I think they have some information in them. They may not be perfect, but I think they're useful.
Well, how about the high-stakes tests, the ones that were authorized by No Child Left Behind? The federal government asked the states to do these tests, and most states have, in fact, put them into place for quite a number of years. And every student has to take those tests every spring if they're in grades 3 through 8 and again in high school. So what do you think of these high-stakes tests?
So I think in general they're a pretty good idea. I think the devil's in the details in terms of implementation. So we have states that have written very challenging, high-quality exams and have aligned those exams with their curricula in very impressive ways. So I think there are states, like here in Massachusetts, where the teaching has really changed for the positive as a result of having these tests as the end goal. I think there are lots of examples of states where it's not clear that the tests are very well written or that the teaching has really responded to those tests.
Do you worry about cheating?
Somewhat. We have a lot of evidence from a lot of different situations that these high stakes tests do cause cheating. On the other hand, the amount of it, for the most part, is relatively small. So certainly you don't want cheating to be happening, and you don't want situations where the cheating is widespread. We have relatively few examples of seriously widespread cheating with respect to these high stakes tests.